Welcome to the latest edition of the Law and Society Trust's Roundtable. In this episode, we'll be discussing something that's been in the news a lot these past few months, which is domestic debt restructuring, and specifically its effects on working people and their retirement savings. We are pleased to be joined for this episode by Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar. Dr. Kadirgamar is senior lecturer in the University of Jaffna. He is a political economist and a regular contributor on public issues. Welcome, Dr. Kadirgamar, to this edition of the Law and Society Trust's Roundtable. Thank you for joining us to share with our viewers your reflections and insights on the questions we'll be talking about today. As our viewers need no reminder, we continue to experience the effects of an economic crisis that appears to be protracted, and large sections of our people continue to experience the effects of this in terms of their employment, their incomes, their access to education, access to healthcare, food and nutrition, and in so many other areas. In this context, Sri Lanka defaulted on servicing of its external debt in April of 2022. Since then, there have been several negotiations with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, leading up to an agreement in March of 2023. One element of this agreement is what's referred to as debt sustainability, how to manage the burden of Sri Lanka's debt and how to adjust the stock of debt, the quantum or the quantity of debt. Could you, shall we begin please with you just walking us through this a little bit before we come to the main issue at hand today? Thank you.
Thank you, Kumar, for having me. So Sri Lanka went through what it had never had to face before. That was a default on its external debt last year. This is unprecedented. But this also came at a time of great upheaval in the country, a major economic crisis. And when they defaulted, the finance ministry issued a statement saying, now we are going to very quickly go for an IMF agreement as well as restructure our debt. Now that has been taking much longer than I think the government expected. It took almost another 12 months before the IMF agreement was achieved. And the IMF agreement this time, even though it is our 17th IMF agreement, has an added element of great importance because internationally, the IMF is recognized as the arbiter, if you may, for debt restructuring. In other words, Sri Lanka has said that they won't repay their external debt. Now we have to reduce our debt stock, and somebody has to set the terms of that or frame that so that we can take forward the negotiations with our creditors. And internationally, the IMF is recognized as that kind of a arbiter. Now, if you look at our debt, it has various components, our external debt. Some of it is owed to multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Some of it is owed to bilateral creditors, China, Japan, India, many European countries. And then in recent times, in the last decade and a half, much of our debt, almost close to 50%, is also owed to big private creditors, multinational banks, mutual funds, to whom we have sold bonds, which we have to repay. So this kind of a restructuring, we need IMF's support. But the IMF also has placed many other conditions in terms of how the path forward would go forward. So for example, the two big things, in addition to debt restructuring, which the IMF says that Sri Lanka has to complete with its creditors, and also they have demanded a primary budget surplus. In other words, revenues should be higher than our expenditure. Now, this is a very difficult target in a short period of time, because just last year we had a 3.7% budget deficit. And from that, next year in 2024 to go to a budget surplus, and by 2025 to a 2.3% budget surplus, which means either we have to rapidly increase our revenues or decrease our expenditure. And reducing our expenditure seems to be the path that the government is taking, what we call austerity measures. So all these conditions of the IMF, the two primary ones being debt restructuring and fiscal consolidation or budget surplus. But in addition to that, they have set targets in terms of, as per their debt sustainability analysis, how much we will be able to repay each year, what our debt servicing could be, what we should do with our state-owned enterprises, because they claim so much of state coffers are drained through these state-owned enterprises, what we should do, people's everyday needs such as energy, energy costs, whether it's electricity or fuel costs, that we should market price them. So there are a number of conditions that come along with it. And what we are seeing this year, the policies that the government is taking forward, I would say, are based on two major documents. One is the IMF agreement, as you mentioned, which came out in March this year. And the other is the World Bank Country Partnership Framework. The IMF agreement sets the conditions, the targets over the next 4 years. Similarly, the 4-year country partnership framework of the World Bank, they are going to provide the support for implementing many of those conditions. And they are starting with changes to our laws. Already many of them are being drafted. And then step by step implementing these, what they're calling reforms. So this is going to have a far-reaching impact on Sri Lanka's political economy, the future of working people's lives. So we should really look at this very carefully. And myself and my research team, one of the things that we're doing is looking at it in detail, month by month. It's almost as if the government does not have any independent policy. It's on autopilot. It's just following these conditions of the IMF and the programs of the World Bank.
So when this crisis exploded and when it was clear that we couldn't service our debt, what we were fixed on, what we were focused on was external debt. It's the debt that's owed to creditors outside of Sri Lanka. It's debt that has to be paid in foreign currency. And we didn't have the reserves. We didn't have the foreign exchange to service that debt. But the conversation these last few months, since June, well, to the public, it feels as if all talk about the external debt has gone very quiet, very silent. And instead, the focus is on domestic debt, which is not something that was on our minds in 2022 or even earlier this year. So could you explain a little? I mean, why is there this focus now on domestic? Of course, this term restructuring, I mean, perhaps it's useful to just simplify that by restructuring is basically meant reduction too, right? And as you just explained, the purpose of this restructuring or reduction is, yes, to reduce the overall burden of debt, but perhaps more importantly, it's to ensure the debt that remains gets repaid. So it's a strategy really to make sure Sri Lanka keeps servicing its debt. In other words, the people of Sri Lanka keep servicing its debt. So could you just explain to us why there has been this shift or switch from the external to the domestic first, and actually what we mean by domestic debt? Thank you.
Yeah. So if we start with external debt, as I mentioned, it's one of the conditions of the IMF that we very quickly restructure the debt. But if you look at what's happened to countries that have defaulted around the world, it has sometimes taken many years to restructure the debt because it's a very complicated negotiation with your external creditors. They don't want a reduction in the debt that's being repaid. And for us to be able to have not only sustainable debt, but to develop our economy, we want to reduce the debt stock so that we can meet our development priorities. Now, as I mentioned, there are three types of major external creditors. The bilaterals, they have forums like the Paris Club where they come together and try to decide, okay, this might be a level of debt that Sri Lanka can sustain. So what they call a haircut, a reduction in the level of debt or the net present value of that debt. Now, China is not part of the Paris Club, and it's a major creditor to Sri Lanka. Now, what China has said is that they want to also see that the multilaterals, the World Bank and the ADB, also restructure the debt, so that it's only then that it's fair, whereas the multilaterals claim that they should not be touched, that they are serving the long-term interests of countries. So there is already one contradiction. So the Western Bloc claims the real problem is China. China is putting some blame on the multilaterals. And China also has this concern that it has become the major creditor around the world. So Sri Lanka would also become a precedent if it is to agree to a large reduction. So the bilateral debt itself is complicated. Then if you take the bondholders, now they've made a killing on Sri Lanka over the last 10 years. These are dollar-denominated debt, many of it on the order of 7.5% interest or higher. And if you compound that over a 10-year period, for example, these international sovereign bonds, the interest payment is almost equal to the principal. So they've made 100% profit, so to speak, over the 10-year term. But for them, they are private actors. Every dollar matters in terms of profit. They're going to try to squeeze out everything. So to reduce the reduction of the debt stock that they owed, what they have said is they want comparable treatment, so there should be domestic debt restructuring. In other words, the Sri Lankan government owes to external creditors as well as to domestic creditors. There are what are called treasury bills, which are short-term debt that the government sells to the public inside Sri Lanka, and treasury bonds, which are longer-term debt. Now, they want also a reduction in that debt stock. So they're putting pressure. They're passing the ball onto Sri Lanka. And while these are very different kinds of debt, external debt, we need dollars to be able to repay it. In other words, there's only if there's foreign earnings each year can we service that debt. Whereas domestic debt, it's in rupees. We can structure it in different ways. We can, float other rupee bonds and roll over some of this debt. We can lengthen the term. So there are many options. But because the bondholders, the external bondholders, are demanding domestic debt restructuring, without pushing back and negotiating, the government suddenly has focused on domestic debt restructuring, or what's called DDR. Now, there are a lot of questions about this. Do we need DDR? I would say no. Even if we were to go for DDR, why are we going for it before we complete external debt restructuring? Is it just to satisfy the bondholders? Because they are going to put every form of pressure to ensure that they can recover every dollar. So we are caught in this trap, so to speak. And because the government can muscle over local creditors, they have decided to focus on DDR. And that too, in a very problematic way. The central bank's recommendation is that they would reduce the treasury bills, which they hold, but it's anyway held by the central bank, so it doesn't really matter. They can always get a cash inflow from the government at any point. Then there are various banks, finance companies, private creditors within the country, wealthy creditors. None of them have been touched. The government has decided to only go after the retirement funds, the hard-earned savings, that is the future of working people once they retire. Now, the target they are working with. Now, the IMF report sets a target of 13% of GDP as gross financing needs. What does that mean? That every year, equivalent of 13% of our GDP is what we can pay as principal and interest. Now, of that 13%, they have said 4.5% can be for external debt servicing in dollars. The rest of the 8.5% is the limit they have placed on domestic debt. And so to reach that 13% target, the central bank has said 0.5% of the reduction to reach 13% would come from retirement funds. In other words, every year for the next 16 years, 0.5% of our GDP equivalent would be taken from the retirement funds earnings, so that the government doesn't have to repay that as interest on domestic bonds. Now, that 0.5% might seem like a small amount, but when you look at it, that's about 3.3% of our expected budget revenues every year. Or what is its impact? Somebody, let's say, is going to retire 10 years later. Their retirement fund would decline by 30%. In other words, 10 years from now, if they are, and with inflation, even garment workers, tea pluckers, they might be looking at maybe a EPF retirement fund of something like 5 million rupees. Now, suddenly, that's going to decline by 30%, so they will only get 3.5 million rupees. But this program is actually going for 16 years. The reduction over 16 years, if you look at what happens every year with this 0.5% of GDP reduction, the whole fund will reduce by 47%, which is almost 50%. So somebody who might be getting 10 million rupees as their EPF retirement will now only get 5.3 million rupees. Now keep in mind, now this after the huge levels of inflation and cost of living last year. So the real value of their fund, even if they retired this year, is 40 to 45% less. In other words, let's say, somebody's retiring this year, they hope to get 5 million rupees as their retirement, and maybe they want to build a very small house. What 5 million was worth 2 years ago to what it's worth today, they would only be able to build half their house. So they've already taken a hit, and the government is now imposing another attack on their retirement.
So how do we then make sense of this? Why this targeting of these particular funds, this particular section of our society? As you explained, many who are EPF holders have really nothing else to their name once they retire. The groups you mentioned, garment workers, plantation workers, they don't have land, they don't have houses, they don't have cars or other fixed assets, really. It's this money that's they've been saving up. So how do we make sense of then why this particular section is being targeted in this way, when, as you mentioned, when it comes to our domestic debt, we also have the banking sector, we also have these high net worth investors and so on. So what's going on here?
Yeah. There's a history to this in terms of what our policies are doing, our economic policies in this country. And I would say over the last 45 years, with the open economy reforms, or what internationally we call neoliberal policies, just 10 years ago, if you take, who were the people who were being targeted with microfinance loans? It's the working people, and particularly working women, women in the rural areas, the most marginalized sections. And our government encouraged, our central bank, our finance ministry encouraged, they said that was the way forward for them. And what did they do? They said they could access credit easily. And if you look at what the microfinance companies did, they would say, oh, we are only charging 22%. But that's a flat rate. When you actually calculate the annual interest rate, it was on the order of 60 to 70%. Then they started day loans, which went up to annual interest rates of 250%. So they have extracted so much out of working people. Now this is another phase of that. They are not going after the wealthy individuals who could easily contribute to the betterment of this country and the reduction of domestic stock. They are going after the working people again. And they're also confusing them by saying, oh, now we will make sure that you get a 9% interest on your EPF. But 9% doesn't mean anything. Like, look at what happened last year. We had 60 to 70% inflation. Even if you get a 9% return, your fund still has reduced by 40 or 35%. So these interest rates, finance, it's difficult for everyone. It's difficult for even the middle classes to understand. But it's an easier way to cheat working people, to deceive them. And at the heart of this process, I would say, is the class question. Who is the government supporting? On whose side are they? They are consistently looking at the benefits of the wealthy in this country while continuing to extract from the poor and the working people. Now, already, if you look at over the last 2 years, working people's incomes, with this huge cost of living, has come down by 40%. In other words, cost of living last year went up by 60%. Food costs went up by almost 100%. But people's salaries have not increased, and that's remained the same. this idea that inflation has come down is deceiving, because inflation is calculated year on year. All these cost of living rise happened until August last year, and certainly by this month, inflation is down to single digits, but it hasn't made any difference in terms of people's lives. Cost of living is very high. Their incomes are still low. Now, the next attack is what happens. This is when they're working, what they're earning. The next attack is what happens to their savings. So on every front, the government is squeezing, extracting the working people while providing benefits, opportunities for the wealthy in this country. The next phase of this is going to be what's going to happen to our public services, what's going to happen to the welfare services that working people in this country have. We're already seeing that. Fuel costs are so high, and particularly if you take fuel like kerosene, which is used by fisherfolk and small farmers, it quadrupled in price last year. Those are what's happening to the inputs. What's happened to electricity? Electricity costs have gone up by 30%. And now they are going to probably privatize education, certainly higher education, privatize various other public services, utilities that ordinary people access. So to reduce them to bare bones so that the actual income, the benefit that they get for their labor is so low that we will be the most competitive country internationally. Because the government's whole program, and as is the IMF program, is to get us back on what they're calling on an export-led growth path. But of course, you can do that if you reduce costs to so low that people are on the brink of starvation. The other thing that the IMF agreement and this whole debt restructuring process is focused on, whether it's domestic debt restructuring or even external debt restructuring, is to ensure the interests of global finance capital or the major creditors around the world.
Just a day or two ago now, we've had the amendment to the Inland Revenue Act passing in Parliament. So it's clear that the current government has a majority which will enable it to push through the plans that it has. So we can expect that the changes that it wishes to see, the changes that were proposed by the central bank back in June, are going to go forward in time for the September review of the extended fund agreement, which is done by the International Monetary Fund as part of its ongoing surveillance or monitoring of this adherence to this agreement. So keeping this in mind, I mean, we've of course seen a number of protests by trade unions on the streets of Colombo and elsewhere. But now, assuming that these changes do in fact go through as the government desires, what do you think now our options and our agenda ought to be from the perspective of working people's movements?
Yeah. First of all, I think the message last year was very loud and clear from the people of this country that they have no confidence in this parliament. I would say this is an illegitimate parliament, and that illegitimate parliament elected a president. So they are the ones taking forward these policies and passing laws very rapidly, even before the next election. So what is passed in Parliament, I think down the line we have to again question, because how can we accept what a parliament that has no legitimacy has passed. Now, if you take this Inland Revenue Act, it's very much tied to domestic debt restructuring, because back in June, the central bank gave two options. One, you reduce the retirement savings of working people, and you agree to it, that 0.5% of GDP reduction every year, or that they would increase taxes on the retirement funds from 14% to 30%. It was a threat, if you may. Now, that is the same entity that makes these recommendations happens to be also the central bank, the custodian of the EPF fund. They are the custodians. They make a recommendation about cutting the earnings of the or the savings of in retirement funds. They pass it on to Parliament and give them the options. Then the Parliament asks the central bank to make a decision and passes this law so that it's, both are options that are unacceptable to working people. Now, very soon, the central bank will now say, well, we chose the better option. Why? Because according to the first option, they say you'll get an average of 9% return on your retirement savings. Now, as I mentioned, 9% is very confusing because when inflation is above 9%, there's actually no returns. The second option with taxation would lead to the equivalent of just 7.7% return. So the central bank will say this is a no-brainer. We have gone for the better option of DDR. I think the position of trade unions, who are the representatives of working people themselves, should be to reject both. We cannot accept DDR on retirement funds. And then if they decide to go ahead with this tax, I think that the message should be, this is by illegitimate parliament. We want the parliament to go. We want a parliament that can think in the interests of working people. So I think there has to be a strong response of the millions of people who hold EPF accounts, as well as their relatives, the public in general. There's another thing that we should consider. This whole process, this is the first time we are all having to study debt restructuring as well. This process has, exposed the character and the workings of some of our institutions. We can no longer trust the central bank to be the custodian of the EPF fund. They have betrayed the people. So I think now we need a process by which the working people's representatives, such as trade unions, possibly some mechanism where independent actors, along with the trade unions, are in charge of the retirement funds. And what are these funds used for these past years? Did we use these retirement funds to build this Lotus Tower and the Southern Expressway? And what were the returns on it? How much better it would have been if this fund was controlled by working people and they said, no, let's invest this to increase employment. Let's invest this to increase the livelihoods of working people. So a fund controlled by working people and the investment decisions, the kind of bonds and where it should go should also be under the control of working people, because our governments have failed us. What does our government then say? Oh, we've failed, so we're going to the IMF. But who does the IMF have in mind? It's the external creditors and global finance capital. So I think the time has come for us to rethink our economic trajectory. We need major changes in our economic policies. And this debate on DDR and what working people are going to face should be a wake-up call to change that trajectory, because we are in a long drawn out crisis. This crisis can possibly last a decade. It's going to have intergenerational impacts. So we have to prepare for a real democracy that takes equality and freedom of people seriously. And I think this is a moment for that kind of reflection.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, for joining this edition of the Law and Society Trust Roundtable and talking us through these issues which are much in the mind of the public these days. Thank you.
Thank you.